Robert. Hey Dutch, I'm a big fan and admirer, and I enjoy the podcast. You guys keep things interesting and fun. Kudos, thank you. I was trained by Chris Adams and worked on his road.
I won't hold that against you.
No, absolutely. Where was I? Worked on his road shows for 94 to 96. I have some crazy stories of my own from that time, but one stands out from the rest. Chris used a crew of roadie types to handle the ring and provide security for events, all veterans of the business. One of the crew told me stories concerning Bruiser Brody's death, that I've never heard since. She said that the Puerto Rico crew was upset over Brody.
She said.
No,
she's a ring crew, and she's a she.
Yeah, there you go. It's also sung by Long Pigs as well. Bruiser Brody's refusal to lose to Dan Spivey, who was champion at the time, so it would allow Carlos Colon an opportunity to challenge for the belt, win, and the territory's hero again. So this fella is saying that he heard that Bruiser Brody's stabbing was over not jobbing to Dan Spivey, who I've already researched was not the champion at the time.
No. That is not true. That is nowhere even close to the truth. I think who was Brody supposed to work with that night?
Dan Spivey. I actually saw the card. I actually looked up the card, and he was meant to wrestle Dan Spivey.
I don't think that match even. Well, I know it did happen, but I don't know who Spivey actually worked with that night. I don't remember, and I wouldn't remember anyway if somebody told me, because there's pandemonium in that dressing room. No, it wasn't over Brody refusing to do it. They had an understanding with Brody. They didn't bring him in just to beat him. They brought him in to, for the big shows, and he'd always do about the same thing. It'd be a double count out, and they'd fight through the crowd and all this. It was about the same all the time. But he didn't refuse to put anybody over, because no, that's totally inaccurate. No. It really was.
We'll stick with Dan's. I'm sorry.
Go ahead. Stick with Dan Spivey.
Well, I was going to stick with Dan Spivey. We've talked a lot about Bruiser Brody. We did a special on his passing. I think maybe it was his 35th anniversary that we did that for. So go hunt that out in the archives, a full episode. But let's stick with Dan Spivey. I hadn't realised he'd been in Puerto Rico. He only went a few times, but have you any stories of Dan at that point?
Well, he didn't much like it, to tell you the truth. If you go to Puerto Rico, it's got its good parts. It's like every place else. It has its really bad parts. And you better find out where the bad parts are so you don't accidentally stray into them after dark, because you probably get shot. The drug trade there is gigantic, because it's on a port, and they can bring those drugs in, and they just go down to the shipyard and pull it right off. Of course, that's a lot of people on the ship getting money too. But you go into the bad part of town, you're in trouble, even if you speak Spanish or not, because Brody was a white guy, so they think he would be maybe police, surveillance, or something. And if people would tell him, no, I'm not, they wouldn't believe him, and he could get shot. So yeah, Spivey didn't go much. I think he called up maybe Carlos called him. I don't know. But I only remember him being down there maybe twice during that period. Mm-hmm. And then after the Brody, it became a virtual ghost town for American talent. Then the American talent boycotted it, and they wouldn't go there. And I did go back, but about 6 years later, because by that time, and the only reason I went, people said, why'd you go back there? Because there was nowhere else to work. Because by that time, the WWF and Vince, he's done a lot of damage to the existing wrestling business. He took it over and then left it to die, the performers to leave he left them to starve to death. But I forgot what I was going to say now.
Well, I'll tell you what, I'll add on to that slightly. Dan Spivey only turned up maybe a couple of times. He didn't actually wrestle, as far as I can tell, on that card. Maybe when Bruiser was stabbed, so maybe they just kept him off. He did tag up with Abdullah the Butcher versus Brody and Carlos Colon in probably a week before the Brody murder, and then he actually went back a couple of months after the Brody murder and wrestled and lost to Wahoo McDaniel. Any other stories about Dan Spivey that that's worth telling?
Well, I like Dan. He played football at the University of Georgia, which was kind of in my neck of the woods. I was only from the campus in Athens. I was only like 60 miles away. So Georgia football was big, as Clemson, for football fans. Clemson was about 15 miles away. So when they played, and they hadn't played, boy, they started back playing here recently, but they were bangers. They were a hell of a games, great games. But he was a quiet guy and smart guy, but you knew right away that if you got out of line with Spivey, he was a big guy too. He was about 6'6", about 260 maybe. So, and he was not very talkative. I mean, he'd talk to you, but he's not like you, James. He wouldn't want to monopolize the whole conversation like you do. And you knew if you messed around with him, somebody was going to get jacked up. And he was laid back and quiet. So what's that old saying? You got to watch the quiet ones. You'd have to watch this guy. But he was a really, really, really good guy.